Hello, and thank you very much for joining my short presentation on AI and competition. My name is Jan Oster, and I'm a professor for media law and the law of digitization at Osnabrück University. Last year, when I attended this conference, I gave a presentation on AI and pluralism or diversity of opinion. This year, I'm taking a slightly different perspective on what is more or less the same topic, namely the perspective of competition law. Social networks operate algorithmic systems that aggregate, select, and present content, thereby influencing opinion formation. And AI-generated content such as Google Gemini or ChatGPT is increasingly serving as a source of information. So rather than to Google a certain information, people increasingly ask ChatGPT and then they get just one single answer for their question. This is a problem for media law. This is a problem for media regulation, something I addressed last year, but it's also a problem for competition law, right? Rather than different providers, service providers, offering their services as competitors, people increasingly tend to use one service provider to get certain information. And this, I think, raises certain challenges that we have to address. Yeah. When it comes to AI and competition, two problems need to be addressed. One is the threat to competition posed by AI, meaning threats to competition via the application of a certain AI system. Second, the opportunities, but also the threats to competition for AI, meaning the development level, the development of AI systems. Let me briefly begin with the first pillar. AI poses a threat to competition. Yeah? And this applies in particular to the collusion between certain companies with the help of algorithms and systems of artificial intelligence. So AI systems can, for example, be used to monitor compliance with prohibited agreements and to increase cartel discipline. Competitors can also implement agreements on price changes with the help of price algorithms or the algorithm of a platform operator. And then there's in particular the problem of algorithmic collusion. AI systems can be used by companies to observe the behavior of competitors and adjust their own company's prices, thus establishing a price equilibrium above the competitive level. Plus, AI can be used by a single company to abuse their dominant position, for example, by way of algorithmic pricing. So it's, for example, debatable whether the adjustment of individual consumer prices is an abuse of a dominant position. So, for example, when a platform adjusts its prices with a view to the ability of this single consumer, the ability and the willingness of this single consumer to pay a price for it. So we, as different users, as different consumers, would have to pay different prices depending on, for the same good, obviously, for the same good or service, depending on how the algorithm determines the price to be paid by us. So these are threats to competition posed by AI systems. Yeah. But I don't want you to think that I'm a sort of AI Luddite. I'm team AI. I'm very much in favor of AI. I'm quite confident that AI has the potential to make the world a better place. Yeah? And therefore, I find it very important that there is competition for the best AI systems, that we as users, we as consumers have a diversity of AI systems at our disposal. And I think that competition is a very, very important tool in order to ensure that this is the case. Yeah? AI has the potential to cause significant upheaval in markets and thus lead to what the economist Joseph Schumpeter called creative destruction. Creative destruction. So a sort of constructive destruction. Yeah, old industries are being destroyed and new industries are being created. AI is able to foster, to strengthen this process. AI strengthens competition not only by optimizing production processes, but also by promoting innovation and creating new markets. So AI can contribute to pluralism, can contribute to diversity, as long as we have a variety of AI systems at our disposal. But here's the catch. The inherent laws, the intricacies of the digital economy could override the competitive mechanism surrounding AI. And this is what I choose to call the AI paradox. As I've said before, AI has the potential to cause significant upheaval, to cause disruption. That's the potential of AI. But I'm afraid that in reality, AI doesn't lead to more competition, but even to less competition between companies. And thus also indirectly, but very importantly for the purposes of my own research, to less diversity of information and of opinion. So why is this the case? When we take a look at the AI value chain, and this is a very simplified version of the AI value chain, the infrastructure level, the data level, the model level, and the application level, we see that at almost every stage of this value chain, the powerful position of the big tech companies, Alphabet, Amazon, Apple, Meta, you name them, their powerful positions are evident. So each step of this value chain is essentially a bottleneck. And even if it's not the powerful big tech companies that have a position of a monopoly, or at least an oligopolistic position in this value chain, it's another company that might have a monopolistic position in this value chain and might be interwoven with the big tech companies. So for example, when it comes to computing power, when it comes to chips, it's NVIDIA that is essentially the most important provider on this market. When it comes to the model level, it's essentially the big tech companies that are in a position that are able to program, to provide their own AI models. When it comes to the application level, ChatGPT ultimately has to run on our smartphones. And this is essentially where Apple owns the bottleneck infrastructure. And this applies, in my opinion, in particular to the data level. And that's one example for a point that, in my opinion, regulation has to address and regulation can address in order to safeguard competition in the race for AI and thus also diversity of opinion, diversity of information between AI systems. In order to train an AI model, you need a lot of data. Who has this data? It's essentially the big tech companies. The big tech companies have accumulated this data they need in order to train AI models through years of data collection. Yeah? So the companies that have most data, or to be more specific, the companies that have the best data, ultimately will also have the best AI models. How can and how does regulation react? Here are just a few examples that I consider very important. On the one side, the use of certain data in order to train AI models may be considered the abuse of a dominant position. So here we are again under competition law, which is why I think competition law has such an important role to play in this context. The use of certain data as training data may constitute an abuse of a dominant position. So the use of data by big tech companies is limited by competition law. And there is one rather famous case that even made it to the European Court of Justice, and that's a case decided by the German Federal Cartel Office in the case of Facebook, where the Cartel Office, the Bundeskartellamt, decided the use of certain data by Facebook, personal data in this case, constituted an abuse of a dominant position. Yeah? Similarly, the Digital Markets Act in the European Union, which is somewhat similar to competition law. It's not exactly competition law, it's probably a sort of regulation sui generis, but nevertheless, for the sake of simplicity, let's just say it's also sort of competition law. The Digital Markets Act contains several provisions that restrict the use of data by what the Commission designated to be so-called gatekeepers. So, for example, providers of social online networks. Yeah? So these are limitations to the use of data as training data for the big tech companies. Secondly, and in my opinion, almost as important as the first point, perhaps even more important, that's access to data by competitors. So again, it's the big tech companies that have the data. So I think competitors should be given access to that data. And again, competition law can play a major role here. The refusal of a company with a dominant position in the market to provide data to competitors may constitute an abuse of a dominant position. It may constitute an abuse of a dominant position. So this company has to grant access to its data to competitors. There are also certain provisions, again, in this DMA, in the Digital Markets Act, providing rights for access to such data. And I would even go further and say that access to data is more or less becoming a general idea of EU law. The free flow of data, data as a tradable asset, is now a general idea of EU law. And this is in particular expressed in an EU regulation called the Data Act, which essentially sets out the conditions under which access to data has to be granted. I think that access to data can foster competition between companies and thus also provide a more diverse, a more pluralistic landscape of AI models and systems. I'm happy to discuss this further with you. So this would be questions I think we should address in the public debate and also in the academic debate. How can regulation, competition law in particular, but also regulation in general, including media regulation, how can regulation avoid repeating the mistakes of the past, the concentration of power in the hands of single companies? We see history repeating itself now with regard to AI systems. How can we avoid that? How can regulation avoid being too late again? But also a more optimistic outlook. To what extent can AI contribute to a more diverse and pluralistic information landscape? I would find it extremely dangerous if on the long run everybody would just be using ChatGPT in order to gather information and nothing else. Just as up to now we have just Googled the internet in order to find information online. But I would be very optimistic if we had more AI systems at our disposal in order to gather information. If we would, for example, ask ChatGPT first, but then we would have another system, another AI system, another system of generative AI that we could also ask, and that might provide a slightly different outlook on the same topic. I think that AI really has the potential to contribute to a more diverse and pluralistic information landscape and also a broader outlook on opinions that are out there. Yeah. A more detailed question, slightly legalistic question, but nevertheless a question that I think we have to think about very hard. Does generative AI have to be treated as a mere information intermediary or as a content creator in its own right? This is a very, very important question for regulation as well. To the extent that we say generative AI is a content creator, the providers of such systems, such as Google, for example, they would be fully liable for the content that their AI systems create. But to the extent that we say, no, they are mere intermediaries, they essentially merely summarize and convey what others have said before, because they essentially get their information from the internet. Well, to that extent that they are intermediaries, they are probably to be exempted from liability. That's a very, very important question that we need to ask. Do we want to treat them as we have thus far treated, say, online platforms or search engines on the one side? Or do we want to treat them as providers of their own content, as content creators on the other side? And then, of course, always the question, what about us? What about humans? What's the role of the human in the loop? And that's a question, again, that relates to my research in particular. What about algorithmic journalism? What about journalism conducted with systems of artificial intelligence? Can AI systems be journalists? Or do we ultimately always need a human being who looks at the content before it's being produced, before it's being published, in order to call that journalism? These are questions, and more questions, of course, that I would be happy to discuss with you. But thus far, I thank you very much for your attention and for joining my little presentation.